to Youth Sunday School. Today we are on our third week of our Black History Month series during February, and our person for today is Fred Hampton. So Fred Hampton has recently come back into the public eye due to a biopic about him being released called Judas and the Black Messiah. I haven't seen the movie yet. I plan to, though. I want to see it, and if you watch it too, let me know and we'll talk about it. And a warning before we jump into this lesson, it does have stories of violence, and shootings, and death, and so just be emotionally ready for that. So, let's go for it then. Fred Hampton. He was born in 1948, and he was assassinated in 1969 at the age of 21. So, his story is a short one, but an impactful one. He lived in Chicago. He joined the Black Panther Party in 1968. So if you don't know what the Black Panther Party is, it was a political party and a movement of black people, and the full name of it was actually the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The people in the Black Panther Party advocated for black Americans to fight back against the oppression that they faced, sometimes literally fighting, which has earned them a lot of criticism in history. A lot of people disapprove of the Black Panther Party's methods because of how much we like to revere Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose approach was strict nonviolence and peaceful protest. And so because we like to revere Martin Luther King Jr., we also like to revere his methods of nonviolence, which means that often our views of the Black Panther Party are made negative because the Black Panther Party wasn't necessarily against the use of violence in order to protect themselves from the government and law enforcement. Anyways, Fred Hampton quickly became a leader in the Black Panther Party due to his ideas and his passion for changing the world. He had a vision for how things could be, and that vision spoke to people and inspired people, and so he gained popularity really quickly. He was the chairman of his local chapter of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, in the neighborhood of Maywood, and he did a large amount of community organizing work, so getting people together to, do good things. He was also a gifted public speaker, and he had experience working with the NAACP. So all that before the age of 20. Wow! He put together a few notable programs. One was free breakfast for children, so feeding hungry children who needed breakfast and couldn't otherwise get it. Health and medical clinics, so providing health and medical care to those who couldn't afford it but needed it. And then, finally, the Rainbow Coalition. The Rainbow Coalition was probably what drew more negative attention to him and led to his assassination. The Rainbow Coalition was an effort at bringing together poor Black, white, and Latino people in order to fight against economic inequality. Interestingly, and something that's good to know, is that when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he was doing the same kind of work, trying to bring together poor people across racial lines in order to push against those in power who were trying to keep them poor. And that's just important to note because a lot of times people with a lot of power will turn to the powerless and tell them to fear each other instead of looking at the real problem, which is a few select people holding all the power. And especially because of his Rainbow Coalition efforts, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director at that time of the FBI, he named Hampton as a threat to the security of the country, basically called him a domestic terrorist. Fred Hampton, who had been organizing in Chicago to create healthcare clinics and feed children breakfast. The FBI had a program called COINTELPRO that worked to undermine black groups and leaders seeking better lives for black Americans. So, even though the Civil Rights Act was passed, even though schools were integrated, there were still systemic groups and powers in place that were still enforcing racism and trying to keep black people from achieving equality with white people. In 1969, after Fred Hampton had been sentenced to prison for, in my opinion, bogus charges, because it had something to do with an old traffic violation, and allegedly stealing some ice cream. Before he went to prison, he was killed in his bed by local law enforcement and died beside his fiancée, who survived. And it turned out that William O'Neill, his bodyguard, was an FBI informant and had given the officers the layout of Hampton's apartment. So essentially, Fred Hampton was betrayed by someone he trusted and believed to be his friend. The officers entered his apartment with a warrant for illegal weapons, and they shot and killed others in the apartment as well, including through the walls at where they knew Hampton's bed was. It's reported that 89 to 99 shots were fired, with only one coming from someone who actually lived in the apartment, trying to defend themselves. No illegal weapons were found. The officers involved were charged with obstruction of justice, but they were never convicted, which means they never faced any actual justice or punishment for what they did that night. And so, just as quickly as that, one night, December 4th, 1969, a light was extinguished. And so, there have been movies made about Fred Hampton. One was a documentary in the 70s. And then, recently, this year in 2021, Judas and the Black Messiah came out. I already mentioned it toward the beginning of the lesson. And so it kind of puts Fred Hampton and William O'Neill in the positions of, like, Jesus and as Judas. And I think that part of why it was titled Jesus and the Black Messiah was because of a J. Edgar Hoover quote, where he had called the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the country, and he was afraid of the rise of a Messiah that would unify and electrify the militant nationalist movement. But aside from just that one quote, there are similarities between William O'Neill and Judas and Fred Hampton and Jesus. William O'Neill, like Judas, ended up taking his own life after betraying Fred Hampton to his death, the same way that Judas did in the Bible. And just as Jesus stood as a threat to the stability of the Roman Empire, Fred Hampton stood as a threat to the American Empire. And both Jesus and Fred Hampton were put to death by those afraid of losing their power. And in that way, Fred Hampton is a lot like Jesus. Of course, disclaimer, you can't compare anybody exactly to Jesus, because Jesus is perfect and loving and kind in all the ways that we strive to be but never fully attain. But there are ways that our lives do resemble the life of Jesus, especially when we commit to being like Jesus. So anyways, like I said, if you decide to watch the movie, let me know. I want to hear your thoughts about it, and I plan to watch it too. So today, recent news is that his childhood home is set to become a community center and a museum in Chicago, where he grew up, because his son survived. His fiancée was pregnant when Fred Hampton died, and his son is named Fred Hampton Jr., and Fred Hampton Jr. recently finished a fundraiser on GoFundMe to turn this old home into a community center and museum, which I think is really cool, and next time I get to visit Chicago, I'm going to try and see this place. And I want to end with a quote from Fred Hampton. "If you walk through life and don't help anybody, you haven't had much of a life." So I think that Fred Hampton always knew that his ideas and his vision were dangerous to the people in power. That his ideas and his vision put him in danger because he wanted so much change in the world that it threatened people's comfort. Fred Hampton literally died for what he believed in. He was killed for it, for wanting to see the world be different than it is. And so I want to let his story inspire us. Not that we should all try and get killed by the government. Please don't do that. But that you just need to speak up and continue sharing your vision of how the world could be, and trying to work to make it happen. That's part of our calling as Christians, is to bring God's reign to earth, to bring peace and fulfillment for all people, not just a select few. I hope that despite the darkness of Fred Hampton's story, it's able to give you some hope today. that there is still a struggle going on for justice and for equality. There is still a struggle going on among poor people to try and gain some power and not suffer all the time. And so I hope that in following Jesus, you're inspired to try and make things better for people.